Well, Chris, recent revelations in the news have told us that it's Jeffrey Epstein's world and we only live in it. You, as a chronicler of Noam Chomsky, have things to say about what has been released. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Well, when Prince Andrew was having quite, from his point of view, quite a nice time with Jeffrey Epstein, I don't think any of us were surprised. I mean, he's that kind of guy. And I suppose when that absolutely corrupt inventor of New Labour, Peter Mandelson, when he was found to have been intimately connected with a sex criminal, again, we weren't too shocked or surprised. But Chomsky, my God, as I understand it, particularly in the States, the sort of massive, almost religious community of Chomsky worshippers have been in total meltdown, not knowing what on earth to do, since it was revealed, about a month ago, that actually the correspondence between Chomsky and Epstein was orders of magnitude greater, more numerous to's and fro's, in emails than between Trump and so many other characters. So it came as a terrible, terrible shock. So what do I say exactly? I can't claim that because I've written a biography on Chomsky, I can't claim that therefore I expected this crap, and I can't really claim that anyone who reads my biography will find it easier to explain what's been going on. What I will say is that, as I show in my book, Chomsky spent his whole life moving between two versions of himself, moving between the activist and the scientist, moving between carrying out a kind of role as the United States' number one critique of the US military, while at the same time spending just about all his life, all his adult life, working for the US military. You can see how he's been kind of leading a split life. I've actually called him two people. I think there are two Noam Chomskys. One, the anti-militarist activist, the other, the scientist working pretty much all his life, if not always in the pay of the Pentagon, certainly working in the Pentagon's number one university, and certainly in the early years, given the responsibility of developing at least the theory, not necessarily rolling up his sleeves with a screwdriver and making electronic equipment, but working on the theory of command and control of nuclear missiles. I mean, what Chomsky was asked to do, was expected to do, was find a way of kind of using language, I suppose. It is sort of linguistics, but finding a way of talking to missiles and telling them which way to go. So instead of having to have generals who could work out how to handle computers, you could use ordinary English as a control language. That means a sort of language for command and control of missiles. And that, obviously that would be quite easy, much easier for the generals to just use some version of English than to expect those generals to work out how to use computers. So he's always been a sort of dual figure. And then just to sort of summarize where that gets to Epstein, Chomsky, the activist, regarded the people he was working with and working for very often as effectively war criminals. And yet he found good things in those criminals. He had to work with them, he became friends with them, he found positives in them. And so I suppose what I'm just saying is that coming across a criminal, in this case with Epstein, a sex criminal, but then finding good things about the criminal, that was second nature to Chomsky. He was doing that all his life.
Yes. So Chomsky, for me personally, was one of the first like radical leftists I've read. So I have like a kind of a soft spot for Chomsky. No more, I must say. What always surprised me with Chomsky was that he spent, like, I don't know how many books Chomsky has authored or co authored, perhaps, I don't know. I'm sure it's close to 100 or more by this stage. In all that time, though he called himself an anarchist, as far as I'm aware, there's not a single book that he wrote on anarchism. Now, there is one book, I think, where he's interviewed some selections on of
Yeah.
interviews of him from the 70s where he talked about anarchism, but he never ever actually tried to contribute to any kind of a revolutionary movement that he so-called espoused.
That's absolutely right. And in fact, during the May events in France, when there was pretty near a revolution against de Gaulle, with the students and the workers combining in a massive nationwide uprising, Noam was against it. I mean, that was the nearest we had, one of the nearest things we had to a genuine proletarian revolution in the West, following on from the Russian Revolution. I mean, obviously we had other massive upheavals and so on, but during Chomsky's early period of activism against the Vietnam War in May 68, the so-called events in France, he was quite explicitly hostile about the whole thing.
What was his reasoning?
Well, his political philosophy is a rather unusually consistent bourgeois democrat. He was a principled advocate of genuine democracy, which never crossed over into anything remotely like proletarian democracy, and the very idea of class struggle was completely alien to him. So, unlike most bourgeois Democrats, he was very consistent and admirably consistent and principled and honest, and, you know, one way of putting it, I suppose, is speaking truth to power. And I definitely think that today, with what's going on now in the Middle East with Donald Trump and with Netanyahu and all these other criminals, I mean, there's no question about it. We do miss Noam. It's a terrible loss that he's had such a terrible stroke, and we've lost that voice. But he was never a revolutionary, although of course he was in many ways sympathetic to one side rather than the other. He tended to take the side of North Vietnam, Cuba, Venezuela, different countries which were to the left, in some ways linked to what we used to call Stalinism, linked to the previous period, to the allied in some way, like Cuba, to the Soviet Union. And he would tend to take their side in some kind of critical way, but he himself was a Democrat, and I would say nothing more than that. And then, of course, that's quite a good thing. Of course, I don't belittle that. A Democrat who's genuinely a Democrat, who's principled, who's consistent about advocating and supporting genuine democracy, that is no small thing, and he was that. But he was very careful not to step beyond that. Certainly, an advocate of revolution. Not once, as I think you've just hinted, not once did he suggest that he himself would in any way contribute to a revolutionary transformation of society.
Yeah, like if you listen to his speeches, his lectures or whatever, you know, they tend to be fairly heavily riddled with what we might call kind of references to kind of, you know, liberal philosophers or stuff. So one book he would frequently talk about would be Limits of State Action by Wilhelm von Humboldt. Another one he would mention would be Wealth of Nations and Adam Smith, about how Adam Smith was quite radical and he wasn't the right wing person, but he would never really talk about Capital or Marx, only usually in a derogatory sense.
I would go further. Chomsky's role was to replace Marxist materialism with a completely different mentalist, idealist, CIA-sponsored philosophy, which was the antithesis of Marxism. So his whole idea of the mind being a digital computer and the computer being filled with special modules, a module for language, a language organ, but of course then Steve Pinker and so many others, they added different modules. So you had a face recognition module, a cheat detection module, all of those ideas that history has moved as a consequence of modules in the digital human brain. That is the exact opposite of Marxism. That's a form of very strange idealism, And it came to be known as evolutionary psychology, a particular version of evolutionary psychology, evopsych. I call it with my colleagues. That was turning Marxism absolutely upside down after, of course, Marxism had already become genuinely authoritative, particularly among historians in the West. Very few historians could do any kind of reputable history without taking basic tenets of Marx's materialism for granted. But Chomsky kind of sponsored and inspired with enormous military support, institutional support, massive support, the opposite of Marxism. And I think it was deliberate. He was actually quite hostile to Marx.
So, in what way would you say that this kind of idea, the component areas of the brain, specialized language function, the specialized facial recognition function, was non-Marxist? Could you kind of tease that out for listeners?
Well, I mean, in my field of social anthropology, you have different puzzles, problems, challenges to solve. You might have in a particular tribal group, you might have shamanism, and the shaman might go into a kind of trance, see alternative visions, and then from their own point of view, before they say something of importance to the people, they may have traveled up into the sky. It's called astral vision. You move around the stars, you have extraordinary experiences, and after a while you come back down to earth full of new knowledge. Well, how do you explain it? It's actually quite complicated to explain these sorts of things. But one way not to explain it is to say there's an astral travel module in the brain. And yet I know in the heyday of all this nonsense, this evopsych nonsense, it was actually argued that if the best way to explain shamanism is to say there's a module for it. There's a particular kind of thing in the brain, just like the language module. You've got an astral travel vision module, along with face recognition and various other modules. And so can you see what's happening there? I mean, you're taking something in the mind, in the head, and thinking of enormous complexities inside the digital architecture of the brain. You don't worry too much about the complexities of economic exchanges and production and relations to production, all the different things you might think might have something to do with the way people think, the way they live in some ways, the way they make a living, the way they exchange with each other. You might think that's got something to do with the way people think. But no, evopsych said what you do is you examine the different potential or actual modules. And the only module which everyone thoroughly believed in as a sort of bedrock of all the other modules was Chomsky's one, the language module, the language organ. So language is an organ. And I mean to say it's non-Marxist, I mean, for example, the language organ, according to Chomsky, has got nothing to do with social relations. Language is not even for communication. You do linguistics as a version of natural science, because the module is a part of your biology. And a child doesn't actually learn anything. A child, when it acquires language, doesn't learn, because if you had learning, that would mean you're doing something to do with cultural studies. So you have to say that the child had installed in it from birth all the different versions of language which there are. And I mean, it's as soon as you start thinking about the idea of a language module, and it just becomes evidently absurd, but with massive institutional funding and backing, somehow complete absurdity was taken to be somehow some version of science. I mean, to say that language isn't for communication, it's just for privately thinking in your head. Chomsky actually said that. He said, yes, of course you can communicate with language, but you can communicate with your hairstyle or the way you walk, or by slamming a car door very loud. That you're making a point. But he argued that language is no more designed for social intercourse, for communication, than one of those things. Maybe the kind of Brill cream you've got in your hair or something.
Right. He says, makes the point, I think, that language is kind of like, really its basis is in thought, and it's a kind of like a side effect that we use it for communication.
That's right, yes. Now and again, just like you can use your hairstyle for communication, you might choose to use language for communication, but language isn't for communication. It's not designed for that function.
I haven't looked into the Epstein emails, but I've heard a couple of reports. What are the type of things that were in there by Chomsky? Have you done a trawl for your sins of all of this rubbish?
Yes, I mean, in March 2015, after meeting Epstein for the very first time, Chomsky described the convicted sex offender. He already knew he was a sex offender because all that happened in 2008 and 2009. Chomsky described him as my favorite person to debate ever. And then by the end of that year, Chomsky was confiding to Epstein that all sorts of personal details about I've had a minimal social life, very few friends. And he said that knowing Epstein, in his own words, has been a whirlwind of mind-bending experiences, ranging from politics to all sorts of other things, including to jazz. And so he was absolutely swept off his feet by Epstein. I mean, it was extraordinary degree of passionate fondness for him. And then over the following years, Chomsky's wife, Valeria, wrote to Epstein describing him as our best friend. I mean, the one, the best friend someone could dream about. Our best friend, she wrote, we love you. And then in late 2018, Chomsky himself wrote to Epstein saying, it's one of the great experiences of our life to have you as a friend and to remain so and cherish this permanent relationship. And then as media accusations built up against the sex offender, Chomsky continued in the same vein, writing to Epstein reassuringly, we're with you all the way, and you're constantly with us in spirit and in our thoughts. I mean, this is just beyond it. It's just, and it's no good saying that poor Noam was sort of vulnerable or tricked or something, because he's a very, very, very intelligent political figure. He was very good at seeing behind the mask of all sorts of figures. It's not just. It's not. If we start saying that poor Noam, he was a bit naive, he was a bit honest, he was too trusting of people because he was honest himself and expected other people to be the same. We're starting to make kind of excuses for Noam and to start forgiving what, to my mind, is the unforgivable. And of course, it gets close because what Chomsky was doing was legitimizing Epstein, giving him, helping to clean up his reputation. I know that some feminists, many other activists, have said it's bordering on collusion with Epstein, because if you start enabling the guy and giving him a cleaning up his reputation, you're helping him to carry on doing the crime that he was engaged in. So it is really absolutely shocking. I mean, but of course it doesn't alter the fact that, objectively speaking, he was getting a bit old. He was in a crisis. He did need some help. He was in a terrible dispute with his own son, Harry. Maybe we could go into some of that. I don't know too much about it all, and it seems a little bit unpleasant, really, to be delving deep into these personal matters of Noam. And of course, he would have had absolutely no inkling that all that stuff would sort of suddenly come out into the public domain. But it's very hard to forgive. I mean, what it makes me feel is that Noam was corruptible. And of course, what I've written in my book about Chomsky is that corruptible is a bit too strong, I suppose. At least it was a bit too strong. But Chomsky knew what he was doing all through his life. He nearly resigned from MIT during the Vietnam War, owing to that university's intimate connection with the Vietnam War, with carpet bombing of North Vietnam. And he actually said at that time in the late 60s, I'm finding it difficult to look at my face in the mirror. So I suppose what I'm saying is that he came close to resigning from MIT because he didn't want to be, his conscience was hurting him. He didn't want to be colluding with the military, but he didn't resign. It was obviously, he'd got an extraordinarily high-profile, high-status job. It was too much, perhaps, to expect him to resign from MIT. And so instead of resigning, he kind of combined working for the military with working against the military. He stepped up the intensity of his anti-militarist activism as if somehow that could compensate for the fact that he was actually working for the Pentagon supposedly designing, first of all, machine translation and second, command and control systems for electronic control of missiles. So I suppose I'm just saying that a certain amount of corruption he felt was okay, but he put limits on that corruption. But it doesn't alter the fact that there was something which I think he himself, in his own conscience, recognized as dubious and shabby going on at the same time as he was signaling his opposition to the US military and its crimes.
You probably know better than most, being in academia yourself, Chris, is that I'm not in academia, so I feel able to say this easily. But there's a cottage industry in people who in academia who can pose as radicals, but actually their job might be to come up with a ridiculous reinterpretation of Marx that takes all the revolutionary aspect out of him. There's a whole cottage industry in academia of these, and these very same people will be, pro-Palestinian, and they'll be pro-workers' rights and all this. But when it comes down to it, they do essentially very reactionary, deeply reactionary work, and it's impossible for them not to be self-aware, because these types of work they're doing are so intricate and require such deep thought that we shouldn't probably, from my point of view, on some level, Chomsky's kind of, as the most famous of these types of people, he's getting nailed to the cross here. But this is not an unusual thing in the inverted commas kind of radical academic milieu.
Yes, I would say it's almost impossible to be an academic and keep your job and still be a real revolutionary. I'm hoping I kind of managed it myself, but of course it is very, very tricky, very, very difficult. And of course, in the end, I did get sacked. I did get dismissed from my university, from the University of East London. It doesn't alter the fact that Noam, from an early age, was a very idealistic young man. He had very strong anarchist sympathies. And initially, he tried out Marxism and different types of Marxism, and then increasingly got sort of nothing kind of worked for him. And he stayed all his life, as you've said, not really an activist, but a somebody. He said to me quite a number of times, he said, "Don't call me an anarchist." He says, "I'm interested in anarchism, and maybe I'm sympathetic with anarchism." And of course, the first essay he ever wrote was, I think, when he was age 12. He wrote a school essay on Barcelona. I think I don't want to think of Chomsky as a fraud exactly. He certainly meant what he said about freedom and liberty and to some extent anarchism. And of course, during the Vietnam War, he traveled to North Vietnam when it was quite dangerous to do that, and he suffered some costs, of course, including being arrested at the high point of the mass student activism against the war. So it's all very, very complicated. To simply call him some kind of pseudo-academic left-wing, but actually kind of false, it's more complicated than that. Yeah, and of course you're somebody, I believe, and I know so many other people who, you were kind of nurtured on Chomsky. Chomsky was like the one figure in science, in academia, who seemed to be true, who seemed to be somebody you could trust, who really would speak truth to power. And of course, when he made his passionate speeches on so many different issues involving the US military and its criminality, it was correct to believe him. He was telling the truth, and he was one of the very few. Of course, the point I make in my book is that one of the reasons he was able to be genuine, the way he was able to be speaking the truth with authority, was because all the time he was an insider. He was inside the US military, a part of that establishment, therefore very knowledgeable about it, because so many of his friends were senior military scientists, people designing chemical weapons, nuclear weapons, command and control systems, and so on. He would meet those people. He was part of them. He was in an electronics lab, a military lab. And of course, that meant that he could speak with unprecedented authority about his own milieu. I always regarded him, and I suppose I can't really now, it's all fallen apart, of course, as in essence, the conscience of America. If the United States of America had a conscience, had a moral conscience, Noam was it. Doesn't alter the fact that he was an insider and a part of the problem.
Yeah, I always say, I don't know if I said it already in the interview, but I always kind of say beware of like the establishment radical. Their politics must be such that they don't inspire actual revolutionary behavior, that they're essentially like the controlled radical, the controlled opposition. And it would seem like Chomsky was a perfect candidate to play such a role in the context of the Vietnam War.
Exactly.
Because there was essentially in the Vietnam War, there was a split in the ruling class over the strategy.
Yeah.
And it allowed someone like Chomsky to filter up and to be accepted in the mainstream as the radical. So one thing that got me, that kind of shocked me initially when I heard it, this was, I think there was some releases a couple of years ago, Epstein file releases to do with Noam a couple of years prior to the most recent batch. I remember hearing that Epstein had arranged a flight for himself and Noam to go and have a private dinner with Woody Allen. And I remember thinking, my God, that is unbelievably shocking. There was a recent documentary a couple of years ago by Woody Allen's daughter and about all the accusations of Woody Allen. And a very shocking scene as an adult. Like when I was younger, I was a massive Woody Allen fan, a really genuinely massive Woody Allen fan. And when I saw the video of Woody Allen doing his media thing, denying responsibility and making his ex-wife out to be like a crazy woman and a spurned woman and all that, man, it was so obviously media manipulation to me as an adult looking at it. It was so obvious to me. And like, I just cannot imagine that Chomsky, a very intelligent, politically savvy, PR savvy person, couldn't have lived through this and have had doubts about Woody Allen, particularly, as the more information gets released, and then to go and meet him with a convicted pedophile. I mean, it was actually staggering. It was a staggering lack of political judgment at the very least.
Well, I mean, to be perfectly honest, I've been kind of dragged kicking and screaming into all this Epstein stuff. And it wasn't what I wrote my book about. It wasn't what I became interested in Chomsky for. So I'm kind of happy to talk about it, but of course I'm absolutely no expert on all the different episodes of Chomsky's relationship with Epstein. It depends. I don't know. It just depends what people are interested at the moment in. As I said earlier on, it's that Chomsky has always been two people. One spending his life working against the US military, regarding those people that he was working with as criminals. And on the other hand, while regarding them as criminals, he was collaborating in all sorts of ways, although he was kind of careful to say to whoever it was in MIT, John Deutsch, for example, who later became the CIA and was a very close friend of Noam's, what Chomsky was always careful to make sure was that he didn't actually roll up his sleeves, get out a screwdriver, and make anything which would actually work. He would only work on command and control systems when it was just a question of theoretical insights, which would take many years to come to fruition in terms of an actual weapon which you could guide in that way that he was suggesting would eventually be possible by kind of talking to the missile and perhaps talking in a control language which is remarkably similar to English. So that was, in some ways, my point in the book and subsequently is that the entire Chomskyan program of linguistics was a fraud. It wasn't really linguistics. The whole of Chomskyan linguistics, even though he was for 30 years, 40 years, ever since the 60s, early 60s. He almost was linguistics personified. I mean, if the one person came to stand for modern scientific linguistics, it was Noam Chomsky. And yet the extraordinary fact is that it wasn't linguistics. I mean, to study the world's languages, to look at how languages differ from each other, to work out different categories of language and families of linguistic structure and syntactic structure, you wouldn't go into an electronics lab. You do what other linguists do. You might be studying children and working out how they acquire language in stages, which words come first, and how they begin to get little bit glimmerings of grammar, and how they become more and more fluent. Or you might go around different parts of the world and study with a notebook, studying different phrases and different linguistic patterns in the ways, for example, Kenneth Hale, who is one of Chomsky's colleagues at MIT, did. He studied Walberian, Australian Aboriginal language, and so many other languages. The idea that you can study the world's languages or study what different languages have in common by going into an electronics lab, I mean, you should immediately smell a rat. That can't be linguistics. You must be in some way trying to work out how to develop new electronic systems of command and control, and you're treating these different digital computers as if they were human beings, and you'd be treating the mind, the human mind. I mean, he always said that one of the main inspirational features of linguistics is because you're getting closer and closer to the deepest architecture of the human mind. But why would he be able to discover the architecture of the human mind by going into an electronics lab? So I'm just saying, it's an astonishing story. The whole Chomsky story. It's really very, very strange. No field work, no tests, no falsifications, no experiments, no observations. You're just working out in your own head how to develop electronic systems of command and control. Why was that accepted as linguistics? And the other thing connected to that is that nobody could debate with Noam. It was all through those years, nobody could disagree with Noam except Noam. Noam himself could suddenly say, right, everything I've been teaching you for the last few years is completely and utterly wrong. I've got a completely new theory, nothing like all my previous theories, but nobody else could do that. And so everyone would be just made to agree with the latest paradigm, the latest version of Chomsky's theory of universal grammar. The only person who could disagree with it was Noam himself. And I just began to feel there's something very odd about this. You couldn't, disagreeing with Noam on linguistics it's like disagreeing with the Pope or disagreeing with the king. Because the king is the king, he's always right. And Noam was always right until he was suddenly wrong. But he was the only person allowed to say that he was wrong. So Noam was, I mean, the left never really understood this. Most of the left thought of Noam as sort of activist and a writer of sort of political tracts. He was far, far, far more than that. He was the author of what was called the cognitive revolution in the sciences. And these were the sciences which are the ones most important. These were like in archaeology, in human origins, in psychology, in history, particularly early history. I mean, a huge swathe of the sciences intimately connected with human beings was corrupted by this thing called the cognitive revolution. So I became interested in Chomsky partly because I wanted to work out the reason why so many things went wrong with academia in the second half of the 20th century. Instead of Marxism being built upon, not just Marx, of course, all sorts of other people, and Durkheim was another very significant figure, but the whole of social science was just beginning to get off the ground, as well as social history, of course. And to a very large extent, it was all derailed. And the person behind the derailing was Noam. It's not that he did it on his own, but other people who wanted to do that, who wanted to develop a kind of mentalist version of the human sciences. I'm thinking of Steve Pinker as an obvious example, but plenty of others. They drew on Chomsky's inspiration to turn the human and social sciences upside down, doing enormous damage, And yeah, most of the left don't realize the extent to which Chomsky was central to that part of the CIA project. The CIA wasn't simply interested in developing weapons to point against the Soviet Union, but also to develop anti-Marxist ideology. The Evo site was kind of it.
Yeah, I suppose given all the stuff that's going on in the Middle East now, it's probably worth saying something about Chomsky's Zionism, if we could. I remember Chomsky saying in some lectures that he considers himself a Zionist. How does Chomsky square this with his general anti-imperialism? How does he thread this needle?
Well, his early Zionism, when he was a young man, was relatively, shall we say, innocent. He thought of Zionism being some kind of struggle between Jews, collaboration between Arabs and Jews to fight off the British mandate, to fight off imperialism, and somehow the Zionism, in his view, the way he interpreted it, it wasn't racist. It wasn't just Jews. It was, Jews and Arabs fighting together to liberate Palestine. And I think it's true to say that as it became more and more clear that Zionism was not that, it was a form of nationalism and racism, I think Noam distanced himself more and more from Zionism. I don't really think he called himself a Zionist, did he, in the last part of his life? I don't think so. I think he had enough sense to realize that Zionism was a deeply reactionary, racist ideology.
I'd have to go and check the dates of it, but maybe they're like the videos are 20-year-old, but the videos weren't from the 1970s, right? They struck me as, the kind of person who says, well, I believe in capitalism, just not this crony capitalism, right?
Yeah.
That there was some kind of pure Zionist ideal that he could still allow himself to be called a Zionist.
Yes, okay. I suppose that probably is right. Yes, I see what you mean. Yes.
So, Chris, is there anything else then? Do you want to say anything about your Radical Anthropology Group? Because I know they have a brilliant YouTube channel that you have lectures on. How's stuff going with that?
It's never been better. It's never been stronger, more vibrant, more popular, more varied speakers. Camille Power is now running it more than I am. I'm getting on a bit and got one or two things I still like to do, but it's very well attended. The YouTubes are, the Vimeos actually, I think technically they're called, are widely viewed. And I suppose while we're on that, one of the great things which has happened recently is that the number one follower of Noam Chomsky in linguistics, I think it's fair to say number one, Cedric Brooks. He's written, trying to think of the exact titles, but it's something like the Oxford Book of Minimalism, an Introduction to Minimalism, Minimalism for Beginners, Minimalism. I mean, minimalism, of course.
Are these all very small books?
Well, they're quite long books.
Yeah,
actually.
I'm joking.
So they're Noam Chomsky's final incarnation of his whole theory, minimalism, which has got this magical little thing in it. It's called merge. Merge just means you have a word and another word and you merge them together. I mean, maybe it's more than that, but I'm finding it very hard to see what is more than that. But anyway, Cedric Brooks, about 4 or 5 years ago, gave up on Chomsky completely and came over to another whole paradigm, something like construction grammar. And my team working on language and Cedric's, we've been working together. So I think it's fair to say that Chomsky's linguistics is no more. It's just gone. There are still people who sort of vaguely believe in it, but they're not cutting edge linguists. It's just the whole idea of universal grammar didn't work. There's no underlying computer code beneath all the world's languages, and it was just a mistake. And some of the most senior people originally within Chomsky's camp have now come over to something closer to the camp that I'm also involved in.
Will it die? Will universal grammar, do you think, die with Chomsky?
It's already died. I mean, Michael Tomasello is a marvelous figure. He said many years ago, I think 10 years ago, universal grammar is dead. And I don't know if there's anybody really that's still pursuing the idea of universal grammar in anything like a creative way. There might be some people who are still stuck there, but that's the best we can say. There are one or two people who, still clinging on to it, but no new work has been done, to find out what the hell universal grammar is. As I put in my book, when Chomsky was last asked about what exactly is universal grammar, and this was about 2015, 2014, all he could say was, it's anyone's guess. So after all that all that work, all those years, tried to find universal grammar, for him to come up and say, well, it's anyone's guess. Your guess is as good as mine, is more or less what he said. I mean, it's sad.
Well, on that note, I'd like to say thanks very much, Chris, for coming on the show today.
Okay, thank you. Pleasure.